what is it to be an object? Well, an object is something that is not nothing, so it must be distinguishable from nothingness. Okay, it's got to, as it were, stand out above the ground of nothingness, in just the way that the hills stand out above the ground of the field around it. So nothingness is the ground of any object. Okay, not quite the physical ground like a hill, but the kind of metaphysical ground, if you like. That's roughly why I think that reality depends on nothingness, because reality is composed of objects, and objects depend on standing out from nothingness to be an object.
Welcome to Living Mirrors with Dr. James Cook. My guest this week is Graham Priest. Graham is a philosopher and logician and distinguished professor of philosophy at the City University of New York. He's the author of many books, including Logic, a very short introduction from Oxford University Press, Everything and Nothing, co-authored with Marcus Gabriel, and the book One, which has the subtitle Being an Investigation into the Unity of Reality and of its Parts, including the singular object, which is nothingness. Today, we discuss the philosophy of nothingness, everything, and paradox. Hope you enjoy the conversation. Okay, I'm here with Graham Priest. Graham, thanks for coming on the podcast.
My pleasure, James.
Yeah, it's great to have you here. So maybe we can begin with a bit about logic for people who are coming to this topic kind of completely afresh. You know, these are the tools that you're working with that we're going to be talking about today. Yeah, if someone had no idea what this is about and why one would play around with logic, or maybe play around isn't the right word, but why someone would kind of investigate with extreme rigor the study of logic, what would your answer be?
Well, I mean, logic is a very technical subject nowadays because there was a revolution in logic about the turn of the 20th century when mathematical techniques were used for the first real time to analyze logic. But those mathematical techniques themselves are very interesting because logic deals with how you formulate ideas, how you reason about them. The mathematical techniques often allow you to formulate ideas, positions, views in a very rigorous way. And for myself, I find those techniques quite useful when I'm thinking about a subject, because one thing about philosophy is that thoughts can go all over the place, as they can in general. And having a kind of mathematical structure in which to work on ideas helps me to sort of focus, make them precise, look at the consequences and the motivations of ideas. So not everyone who investigates the things that I think about uses mathematical techniques, but I do find that a useful way of proceeding personally.
Right. I think I've heard you say somewhere that the techniques, the mathematical tools are so powerful now that it's possible to construct a system of logic in which any given claim can be proven false. So, you know, if X equals X, something very simple that something is itself, that can actually be, you have a system of logic that works where that's not true.
That's true. I mean, when mathematical techniques were first applied to logic, by people like Gottlob Frege, the great German mathematician, and Bertrand Russell, the great British mathematician, they came up with a system of logic which is now somewhat misleadingly called classical logic. It's classical in the sense that it's probably the first thing you learn if you do Logic 100 at a university. But those techniques were very powerful, and we now know that you can use them to construct many different systems of logic. And as you say, virtually any putative logical principle, there are systems of logic in which they fail. And whether those are good systems of logic is, of course, another question. That's a philosophical question, but undoubtedly the mathematical techniques can be used to do that. As you say, they're very powerful techniques that we can make them do pretty much anything we want to do. Now, the question is, what do we want to do with them? Okay, that's the more interesting question.
Right. And is there a concern here that there's such powerful modes of making systems of self-consistent, relationships in terms of the logic, but that it may be kind of uncoupled from reality, that you're just kind of weaving a very impressive, self-consistent thing that just hangs completely decoupled from what's going on.
Yeah, that's always a concern. Just take physics, for example. You can construct physical models, mathematical models in physics to do virtually anything. We know how to do that. But of course, they've got to be constrained in some way. And in physics, they're constrained by the attempt to explain things in the real world and the predictions they give and so on. And it's equally true in logic. Okay, in logic, you're not quite concerned with things in the kind of physical world in the same way. I'm not saying that. But often in logic, you're dealing with issues that concern things which philosophers call metaphysics, which is probably not what the general public call metaphysics. But no, we're dealing with some of the basic features of reality. And so when you use these techniques, you want things which answer to reality as we think it to be. And of course, how we think it to be is itself a very contentious question. But those are the kind of things which will put constraints on the mathematical tools you use. Now, that's pretty abstract. I can give you some examples if you like.
Yeah, I think why don't you give the examples?
Well, let me give you just one example. A lot of people think that the future is open in a certain sense. So future has various possibilities we don't know about yet, in where the past has not. Okay. Actually, the first person to hold that view was Aristotle. So he said, well, for some things, there's no fact of the matter. For some things about the future, there's no fact of the matter yet. So will the war in Ukraine still be going on at the end of 2025? Maybe it will, maybe it won't. There is as yet no fact about the matter. So it's not now true to say that it will, it's not now true to say that it won't. So that looks as though, if that's right, then a logical principle called excluded middle fails. Excluded middle is either it's the case or it isn't. And what Aristotle is saying is, no, that's not true about the future necessarily. So there is a logical principle, but you can see that it engages with the nature of the future. Okay, the nature of the future is certainly one of the sort of prime features of reality that we deal with. Okay, so that's a very small instance of how the techniques of logic or the principles of logic actually engage with something very fundamental to the nature of the world.
Right. So, I come to this stuff as someone who's kind of trained in the study of perception and sensory processing. And so I tend to, when we think about reality and our ideas of it, I guess I'm very sensitized to the way that our ideas are maps of the world and not reality in itself. And so we spoke about, creating self-consistent structures that could be decoupled from reality. So if someone was skeptical about the power of logic and they just said, well, maybe we're just playing with ideas, we're just playing with words, would it be, my instinct to defend it would be to say, well, we're always doing that to some extent. We're always trying to come up with consistent, reasonable claims about the world, even if our ideas are misplaced. Is that the kind of the core spirit in which this kind of investigation is conducted?
Yeah, look, I mean, let's grant that perception deals with representations of reality. Okay, it's a natural view. Of course, you can represent reality in many ways. We do in imagination. But if you're dealing with perception, you want representations of reality which actually represent correctly, in some sense, whatever that is. And so you need your theory of perception to inform what you think reality is like, or in fact, you may reverse this and take your theory of perception to inform your views of the nature of reality. Well, it's the same way in logic. Okay. It may be less obvious because we're not dealing with physical things necessarily, but the example I gave you about the future does that. We can create systems of logic in which, when we reason about the future, things are neither true nor false. We can create systems of logic in which, when you reason about the future, everything is determinately true or false. Now, which is the right system of logic to use when you reason about the future? Well, then we get into a discussion about the nature of the world, and particularly, the future, which is part of the world in a sense.
Right. And so with classical logic, when one comes across a kind of contradiction or an inconsistency or a paradox, is that typically taken as evidence that something's gone wrong?
Yes.
And then so you initially trained right in classical logic, is that right?
Yes.
And then is that, as what I'm driving towards here, which is this sort of paraconsistent logic that that you work in, where contradictions are not seen as as kind of, I guess, a death knell for a particular logical system. So perhaps you could unpack for people the what contradiction and paraconsistent logic is all about.
Okay, let me try to do this without getting too technical. The first thing to bear in mind is that paraconsistency is a view about logic, what follows from what. Okay. Now, in classical logic, which is, let me remind you, the view of logic that was invented around the turn of the 20th century, if you have some contradictory information, everything follows. So, suppose that Trump is corrupt and not corrupt, then it follows that the moon is 3 feet away. It follows that the Earth has 3 moons. It follows the moon is made of green cheese. If you've got contradictory information, then everything follows. Now, that doesn't sound very plausible, because usually you think there's got to be some kind of connection between premises and conclusions, all right? So it can come as a surprise to people that this inference is taken to be valid. It really does follow. These facts about the moon really do follow if you've got some inconsistent information.
Does it follow because it's as if all bets are off? Because if you can have an inconsistency, does that set the kind of the bound just infinitely far that anything goes?
Sort of. It follows more precisely because a valid inference is one where you can't have true premises and a false conclusion. And assuming that no contradiction is true, then if your premises are inconsistent, they can't be true. So whatever the conclusion is, it's not the case you've got a true premise and a false conclusion. Okay, that might have been a bit fast. But it's this principle, which is called explosion, is such that if you've got inconsistent information, it literally, well, not literally, it metaphorically explodes to tell you everything, right? And this is a standard principle of inference. And it's not quite as crazy as it sounds, but it's standard. And a paraconsistent logic is one where this principle of inference fails. So contradictions entail some things, but not others. They don't entail everything. Okay, that's paraconsistency. Now, there's a principle in philosophy called the principle of non-contradiction, which says that contradictions can't be true. Okay, and so to revert to the way you framed the question originally, it's been traditionally assumed that if you've got a view that's inconsistent, something must have gone wrong somewhere. And this view goes, and it's orthodox, all the way back to Aristotle in Western philosophy. Now, some people, such as myself, reject this orthodoxy. And we think that sometimes contradictions can be true. They might be very unusual ones or special ones or whatever. We can talk about that. But some people, including myself, think that sometimes contradictions can be true. That's a view that's now called dialetheism. Now, lots of people are paraconsistent logicians, but they're not dialetheists. They just think the principle of explosion is wacko. Okay, there's no connection between premise and conclusion, so you reject it for that reason. So lots of paraconsistent logicians are not dialetheists, But if you're a dialethist, then you'd better use a paraconsistent logic because you believe that some contradictions are true. And if contradictions imply everything, then everything is true. And that's too much. Okay. So people like me who are diletheists have to endorse a paraconsistent logic in which explosion fails. And now there are many and well-known paraconsistent logics, and their technical details are not contentious. Dialethism is still highly contentious. So that's another reason for keeping paraconsistency and dialethism kind of clearly distinguished.
Right, right. Yeah. So I'm sympathetic to the dialetheist perspective, and but I'm not a logician, so I don't use the tools of paraconsistent logic. And so if you, I guess if people think of the paraconsistent logic, I guess could you say it's a system where you can have contradictions without this fatal kind of anything goes explosion happening?
Correct.
Right. So, my sympathy to the idea that contradictions or paradoxes or inconsistencies in our ideas of the world can be the case, I think is this idea, as I mentioned before, the map is not the territory, where I feel like reality itself is under no obligation to conform to our limited kind of myopic views of it. And we can have multiple maps that are very good that don't cohere, and that's absolutely fine, in the same way that, like, if you try and wrap a spherical object with a rectangular piece of wrapping paper, you'll get these kind of kinks and stuff, and that doesn't really mean there's anything wrong with the spherical object. It's just you shouldn't get over confident in that your ideas, your maps really are the territory and should be able to conform 100% to it. I don't know if that connects in any way to your work, but that's my perspective.
Yeah, look, I think it's important to distinguish between our representations of reality and reality itself, which you did very effectively. It's not unusual for people's representations of reality to be inconsistent. I think everybody's are. So here's an experience I've had. Probably you may have had similar experiences. Sometimes I think about a town and I think that two roads are parallel. I also think they cross. I'm just sort of confused in my representation. Now, of course, that's an inconsistent view, modulo Euclidean geometry. But that's how I represented reality. And, my representation of reality was kind of chunked into different bits, and they didn't fit together particularly well. Okay, so my representation of reality was inconsistent. Now, that doesn't mean that the reality itself was inconsistent. It just means my representation was kind of not quite correct. So clearly, people's representations of reality are very often inconsistent, but that doesn't mean that reality itself is inconsistent, because you're distinguishing the representation and reality itself. The question of whether reality itself is inconsistent, that's a tougher question. And that's the question of dialethism. So could it be the case that one of your inconsistent representations of reality really tracked reality, really got it right? Okay, that's a contentious philosophical question.
Yeah, actually, so my, I guess the way that I think about these things, again, from a kind of neuroscience or perception view, is that I don't really think objects exist independently, objectively in the world as in discrete entities. I feel like that's a conceptual overlay that our perceptual systems kind of impose on the world. And so this leads us into, I want to talk with you about the idea of everything and nothing. And you wrote this book, One, talking about this kind of idea of, I guess, the unitive from this kind of logical perspective, and the existence or non-existence of things like everythingness and nothingness you frame in terms of talking about objects. And so I guess I'm interested there in terms of how you define an object, and if you're defining it in I guess that representational way where it's something that we're talking about but doesn't actually speak to whether it truly objectively is an object out there, or if when you say it's an object, it's kind of taken as a given that it's our perception of it as an object somehow corresponds to it really being an object.
Okay. So, what is an object? Okay. I think the answer to that is actually quite simple. An object is something you can refer to, say things of, um, quantify over, as logicians put it. So Melbourne is an object. I can refer to it with the name Melbourne. I can predicate things of it, such as it's in Australia. I can say something is the capital city of Victoria, namely Melbourne. Okay, so these are the ways I talk about an object, Melbourne. And anything you can talk about like that is an object. Okay, that's sort of not terribly exciting. What is more exciting is whether there's a vast panoply of objects, and the hard questions are, what status do these objects have? Are these objects purely mental? Are they in reality? Are they both? Do they exist? Are they non-existent? So, you know, a 4-year-old might represent reality as containing Father Christmas. That's fine. Father Christmas is an object. You can, name him. I guess it's him. You can predicate things of it. You can say something comes down something comes down the chimney at Christmas. So Father Christmas is an object. No, the hard question is he an existent object, or is it merely an object of your imagination? Or, these are the hard questions. But the question of what an object is, I don't think is terribly hard.
Right. The your hesitancy to call Father Christmas him felt reminiscent of a kind of hesitancy we often have to refer to God as him. So I wonder if there was some, in your representation, if there's some closeness between God and Father Christmas.
Look, I think the gender of Father Christmas is not really contestable. I think the gender of God is a profound theory in theology for those people who believe in God.
Right.
Which I don't, so yeah. I'm not going to go there.
But so this brings us into the theory of non-existent objects, right? So you said Father Christmas is an object, but there are many philosophers who would disagree with that, right? In terms of things that aren't actually existing, But so
yes,
is this...
so some people will tell you that the name Father Christmas does not refer to anything. It's a non. The jargon is that it's a non-denoting term. It doesn't refer to anything. That's not my view.
Right. Is this nonism?
Yes.
Right. Yeah. So, but you're not a nonist, right? You think it's perfectly fine to say that there are certain things that don't exist.
Okay, I am a nonist. Nonism is the view that some things don't exist.
Sorry, I got the wrong way around.
Yeah. And Father Christmas is an example of such a thing. And if you're not a theist, as I am, so is God.
Right. Yeah, the problem here evaporates if you're a theist, I guess. You just think God is a simple object of the everyday kind that just does exist.
Well, certainly I have a disagreement with theists. I mean, theists think that the word God refers to a certain object. I think it refers to a certain object too, just a non-existent object. That's the disagreement. But neither of us thinks that the word God doesn't refer to anything. It's whatever it is we're thinking about when we think of God. And whether you're a theist or not, you think about God. You can think about God, okay? You can wonder whether God exists. God is the content of your thought. Just as if I think about the Eiffel Tower is the content of my thought. So if I'm thinking about God, God is the content of my thought. And the fact that one exists and the other doesn't is irrelevant from that point of view.
Right. And so you've written about everything and the idea of one. And in kind of mystical contemplative traditions, there can be this kind of naturalistic interpretation of God as that, the experience of that unity, that everythingness. I actually wasn't planning on making that connection because I've not seen you write about it in that way. But is there a sympathy to that view of theism where there isn't actually any additional claim to the fact? It's basically saying that everything exists really as an object.
Well, I certainly do think that everything, okay, the totality of all things exists. I think calling that God is a bridge too far.
I think I guess
I
like
think
Spinoza's God
most
would probably
theists
be something like that.
yeah, that's interesting.
It's kind of like a pantheism of just God is the universe, basically. It's, God
Yeah,
is
no,
nature.
that's true. I mean, you're right that um, Spinoza thought that there's just one substance,
Right.
um, and under certain conceptions, you can think of it as God. Um, I mean, this is a very unorthodox theist view. It's, as
Right.
you say, it's a sort of pantheist view. And in most religions, you can get burnt at the stake at this for this.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll watch out for those ones. But yeah, so we've been talking to existence as well. It'd be good to pin down before we get more into kind of everythingness and nothingness, what you mean by existence.
Yeah, well, of course, that's a contentious philosophical question. Uh, I My own view is that to exist is to have the ability to engage in causal interactions of some kind. So, if you
Right.
like, to exist is to be able to function, have effects in space and time. And
Yeah.
if you're a theist, at least of most kinds, you think that God can do that. You know, God uh, uh, brought Christ into existence. If you're a Christian, or communicated with um, uh, Muhammad, if you're a Muslim, or most theists think that God engages in the world in some sense. And if God does, then God exists.
Right. Yeah. So the I think I'm again sympathetic to that idea of defining existence or to be something to be as being to do with causality because if someone's not thought about it that way before, if I were to claim something exists, but I can't show you even the tiniest shred of evidence because it doesn't interact with anything. I have no evidence of ever encountering it. I have no. There's nothing I can say about it. It's totally uncoupled from what we think of this reality.
Sure.
Then what am I
And
talking
that's
about? I'm talking about something that actually doesn't exist.
sure. I mean, that's one reason why Father Christmas exists. Father Christmas does not come down the chimney at Christmas and bring kids presents. I mean, Father Christmas does not engage with the world at all. So he is a non-existent object.
Right, and it's a good naturalistic definition as well because it points to that kind of. I mean, I guess it's part of the reason I'm kind of dyed in the wool non-supernaturalist or just naturalist is the sense that the idea of the supernatural being decoupled from the natural world, but yet has to have some causal interaction, which would make it continuous with the natural world. That feels like a contradiction or a paradox that I can't tolerate. It doesn't feel like a kind of a useful. It just feels like that kind that would just break my. If I'm starting with that as my initial way of thinking about reality, I feel like I can't get started. Maybe that leads to the explosion or something.
Sure. Be careful though, because there are a lot of philosophers who think that numbers exist and are abstract objects.
Mm,
And they're abstract objects means they do not have any causal impact on the world.
right, right.
So, plenty of philosophers think that there are abstract objects which exist and which are not in causal interaction with the rest of the world. So, I mean, the definition I gave you is a very straightforward one. I think very simple, very obvious, but it's not uncontentious.
Mm, right. So we've got objects, we've got existence, and so we spoke already about every. I guess you could say everythingness, just to make it clear that we're not talking about everything. We're talking about a kind of a singular object that is the totality of everything, and
Yes.
that's debatable as to whether it exists, right? And you have a colleague, Marcus Gabriel. He wrote this book with Everything and Nothing because you disagree on this in particular, right? And he thinks. Could you give a summary of why he thinks everything doesn't exist or everythingness as this object that is the totality of everything?
Okay. Let me do that. Um, but let us just be clear that there's a danger of confusion lurking here, because the word everything in English and cognates in similar languages can be ambiguous, is
Mm,
ambiguous. Um, it can be a noun phrase. It can refer to something, um, or at least it's the kind of word that refers to things if words refer. Um, So I wrote a book about everything, but people disagree with me about it. The it is a pronoun which refers back to everything. So it refers to whatever everything refers to. Okay, so everything there must be functioning as a noun phrase. But the word everything doesn't have to function as a noun phrase. It can be what logicians call a quantifier. Okay, so I go shopping, I come home and I put everything in the fridge. Now, if I say I put everything in the fridge, what I mean is for all X, I put X in the fridge. That's a quantifier. It's not a noun phrase. And sometimes when one talks about everything, one can slide easily between the noun phrase and the quantifier phrase. So you've got to be a bit careful. Okay, so that's just a warning. Now let's come to Marcus. Marcus says that for something to be an object, he actually says existence, but that's not really where the point of disagreement is. For something to be an object, it's got to be embedded in a totality of relations. So something cannot be, for example, the opera Madame Butterfly, if it's not embedded in relationship between singers, the genre of operas, performances. It has a sort of its own bit of the world, as it were. So, if that's right, everything must be embedded in something bigger, namely this totality of relations with which it interacts. Okay. Now, suppose there is this thing, everything, namely the totality of all things. If there were such a thing, it would have to be embedded in a larger totality, because everything which is an object is embedded in a large totality, but there's nothing larger for this totality of everything to be embedded in. So there can't be such a thing. Okay, that's his argument. And prima facie, it looks quite good. But there are a few hidden premises here. One is that something can't be part of it, a proper part of itself. Now, Marcus certainly subscribes to that view. I don't, because there seem to be certain objects that are proper parts of themselves. Now, it's contentious, but we know how to make perfectly good sense of that view with the tools of mathematics. The theory of parts and wholes is called mereology. Meros is the Greek for a part. And it's quite standard to have mereological systems in which things can be proper parts themselves. Suppose you've got a proposition of the form A or B. The sun is shining or grass is green. Then a lot of people think that each disjunct is part of that. So the sun is shining is a part of the proposition, the sun is shining or grass is green. Okay. Now you can have propositions which refer to each other. Take the proposition, the next thing I say is true. What I say is the last thing I said was false. So what I just said was the next thing I say is true, and that what I just said was the last thing I said was false. So what I've done is form a proposition which is part of another proposition, which is part of it itself. Okay. So it follows that the proposition is part of the bigger proposition. The proposition itself is part of the bigger proposition. Okay, you can get into paradox very fast like this. So suppose I say this very sentence that I'm saying now is true. Well, the very sentence that I say is the very sentence I say, and I've just said that's true. So it looks as though I've said something about this very proposition, so it's a part of itself. Okay, that's probably a better way of saying this thing. Now, this is all contentious, but quite arguably, something can be a proper part of itself. And so the claim that everything is part of itself, a proper part of itself, isn't really absurd at all. It's quite a standard thought, in fact.
Right.
So that's Marx's argument, main argument, and that's why I don't subscribe to it.
Right. Whereas, so you're arguing that everything that does exist, and I think I wonder if my perspective coming at this not from the perspective of logic, it feels like I'm sympathetic to both being the case, because I guess I would say that there is a unity that is all that is, but at the same time, that can't be objectified because it can't be kind of seen against the background. I'm sympathetic to that as well. That to be objectified, to be an object, is to stand out against some kind of background. So I think that feels like it's.
But it can stand out against the background of itself.
So that's kind of what I was going to say. That what I think the thing is here. You mentioned the idea of the future being open. To me, it feels. I feel like that reality is inherently open or unbounded in some way, where everything can have this relationship to itself, where it's kind of spilling over into itself in some sense. So it's like, so yeah, it both is, but it's not. I mean, this is partly why paradox. I think once you get to this level of the absolute ground, we shouldn't expect our ideas to really cohere in such a neat way.
Well, coherence is one thing and consistency is another.
Right.
We are certainly teetering on the brink of paradox here.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't have to push the ideas that I've given you much further before you get to paradox. That's true. But if something paradoxical is true, we're in the realm of dialetheism.
Is there a difference in your mind with paradox and contradiction?
Yeah, there is. Because some paradoxes are not really contradictions. Some paradoxes are sometimes called veridical. So, for example, there's a result in set theory which says that if you take a ball, you can decompose it, put the pieces back together in such a way that you get two balls of the same size. And this is often thought to be paradoxical, but it's actually a provable theory of set theory, provable theorem of set theory. So a paradox can just be a surprising consequence. So a paradox needn't necessarily be a contradiction. It's just something that's surprising. Of course, if some contradictions are true, that will surprise a lot of people. But some paradoxes tell you that some contradictions are true, and if these arguments for these paradoxes are correct, then some contradictions are true. So reality is contradictory.
Right. So the driving a paradox here isn't necessarily a concern for a dialetheist.
No. There can be paradox conclusion. A paradox just means something that's beyond belief. Okay, roughly, that's a translation of the Greek. And it just means you've got an argument for something which is really bizarre. And in the end, you might...
With the veridical paradoxes, would an example of that be the famous one of the set of all real numbers being infinite, but then if you just take the even numbers out, that's a subset of the first, but it's actually also infinite. That seems like a kind of...
Yeah, that would have been considered paradoxical until the end of the 19th century, when mathematicians, in particular Georg Cantor, who's one of the greatest mathematicians of the 19th, 20th century, showed that that's the way actually you define infinitude. So it's not a paradoxical, it's just a definition of infinitude, right? So that's something which was thought to be paradoxical, and it was just a surprising consequence at the time. But mathematicians don't think it's surprising now. It's just, par for the course of standard mathematics. So a paradox is just something that doesn't seem to be true, um, doesn't have to be a contradiction. Uh, but some paradoxes do end in contradictions, and if those paradoxical arguments are true, well, then those contradictions are true. And so the things which are true include contradictions. So this is dialethism.
Right. And I think that idea of the infinite, perhaps that's just a good example for what I was saying before about how our ideas of the world are limited. And if you try, our ideas are inherently finite. And so if you try and capture infinitude, if you try and apply your finite ideas to that, I think maybe that can give people intuition why, I feel very strongly that we shouldn't be surprised that just doesn't work. They just, some things can just be the case with, especially with regard to how we think about infinities. And we just kind of have to accept that our finite models and representations of the world aren't going to encompass reality and
Yeah,
box it in.
yeah. I mean that's a very natural thought. Philosophers call it realism. Uh, Realism is the view that there's a reality out there, um, and when we think about it, we may get it right, we may get it wrong, but there's a fact of the matter, um, and we, the poor finite beings that we are, think about reality in a certain way. And hey, there's no particular reason to suppose that any of our representations are ever going to get it completely right. In fact, there are pretty good reasons I think they won't, because reality is infinite and we're finite. So um, there's a very plausible thought that reality may well be much more complicated than ever we can get our head around.
Yeah, I mean, I
So
think I I feel like I don't lunge at the opportunity to identify as a realist. I feel like we're going to go on to talk about nothingness and we both I think agree that reality is grounded in nothingness, and I would say that everything is kind of taking place in nothingness. And so this is again why I feel like things break down, because to be a realist about where nothing's truly actually taking place, I don't know, yeah, I guess I'm not going to be able to articulate this. It's kind of I feel like you can talk about the finite nature of our cognition failing without needing to reify a real objective world that we're separate to. Um, I don't have an argument for that. That's just my instinct. But we can jump on to nothingness via, we haven't said yet why you think everything exists.
a while ago, I referred to this subject called mereology, theory of parts and wholes, and um, lots of things have parts. I mean, I have arms and legs and a head, and when you put them together, you get me. Beethoven's Final Symphony, the Ninth Symphony, has four movements, and when you get them together, when you put them all together, you get the symphony. Now, it's a standard principle of mereology that if you've got a bunch of things, you can put them together to get a bigger object. So if you take every thing, that's the quantifier, that's not the object. Take everything, squish them all together, you get everything. That's the object. Okay. So the thought that there is this totality of everything is a standard principle in mereology. It's not uncontentious. Some people jack up at the idea that if you take any old bunch of objects, you could put them together to form a whole. For example, suppose I take three objects, the rings of Saturn, the Buddha's left earlobe, and I don't know, the Eiffel Tower, and squish those together. Do I get an object? Well, if I do, it's a very strange object. So a lot of people think to squish things together to get a whole, there's got to be some kind of connection, some kind of coherence. That's a plausible thought. But if you subscribe to that, then it seems to me that if you take everything, those things are bound together by some very tight connections, for example, causal connections. So everything thing, the totality of each thing, isn't a sort of heterogeneous totality like that triple I gave you. So you can't, complain on those grounds. And I see no ground to complain whatsoever. There's the Gabriel objection, but I don't see any force to that, because it's perfectly standard in Mariology to have things which are proper parts themselves. I gave you a rather garbled example of that, but there are lots of others.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it seems that everything that exists has in common that quality of that it's part of that group of things that exist. So there seems to be some common ground there. But also,
Exactly.
you've made a lot of connections with Buddhist philosophy in your work, and Indra's net, the idea of interdependence, I think, is also gives you some reason to think that everything is woven together in a very real way.
Indeed.
Um, so with if we move on to nothingness, we have the same issue here, right? Of to be wary of around whether we're using the quantifier or the noun phrase.
Right.
And so we're talking about nothingness. Is I think you in a lecture you gave on this. You talk about how Heidegger he referred to it as das Nicht, right? The nothing or the nothingness, and so whereas nothing as in no, there isn't. There are no, there's nothing left of this set of objects or something. The quantifier, there's no single thing left. Um, so with what's your, I guess this is where we get into real contentious issues, right? Like, what's your instinct around the state of the field on this in terms of if you were to take a straw poll of a group of philosophers, do you think the most people are going to be sympathetic to your view that nothingness does exist or not?
No, I don't think they are. I'm used to having unpopular views. Um, but I mean, you're right that the word nothing is ambiguous in the way that the word everything is. So sometimes it can be a quantifier. So suppose I ask someone a question, and then I say, "She said nothing." That's the quantifier. It means for no X did she say X. Okay. But suppose I say Heidegger wrote about nothing, which he did. It doesn't mean for no X did Heidegger write about X. It means you open the pages of the book and you see him referring to das Nichts. Okay, that's the noun phrase. Okay, now, what is nothingness? Okay, I've just told you that in the theory of Mariology, what you get when you put everything together, namely everything, is a perfectly standard object. Okay. Nothingness is the kind of opposite of that. It's what you get when you put no things together. So everything is what you get when you put everything together. Nothingness is what you get when you put no things together. And everything is standard in Mariology. Nothing is not, because a standard assumption of Mariology is that if you put some things together, there's got to be some of them. Now, I think that's just wrong. I think it's perfectly coherent to talk about putting no things together. And of course, when you put no things together, you don't get anything. So that's nothingness, right? Now, we're not going to go into a diatribe about Mariology here. There are some good reasons why the empty squidging together, the null fusion, as some people call it, is contentious. But I think actually the main reason that it's contentious is that it quickly drives you into contradiction. But if you're a dialetheist, that's not necessarily a problem. It might be a problem, but not necessarily. So, for what it's worth, I think that nothingness is what I just call the null fusion. It's what you get when you put, it's the thing you get when you put no things together. And of course, when you put no things together, there's nothing there. That's the quantifier. Nothing is no thing. And that's not a tautology, because when I say nothing is no thing, the first nothing is the noun phrase, and the second no thing is the quantifier. You see how
And
easy it is to get sort of
yeah.
tied up in optic.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm not sure if it does, but I was going to say, does that point to the contradiction that it is, that you're pointing to, that it is both an object and not an object?
Correct. Yeah, that's the contradiction. So nothingness. Let me use nothingness to just
Yeah.
emphasize I'm talking about the object. Okay, nothingness is both no thing and something.
Hmm.
That's the contradiction. It's no thing. Well, I'll just explain why it's no thing. Right? You can put nothing together as many times as you like. You'll never get anything, right? So nothingness is no thing. But of course, it is something because I'm talking about it, you're thinking about it, Heidegger wrote about it. So it's the content of whatever it is that, you and I and Heidegger were doing, were thinking about, writing about when we did these things.
Right. And it's precisely this paradoxicality that, for me, made me kind of first interested in nothing. I mean, so my interest in this came from, again, this strong compulsion towards naturalism of trying to kind of speculate about metaphysics as not as someone who's trained as a metaphysician in philosophy, but just trying to kind of tell myself a story that made sense to me for my own satisfaction. And the story that I came to was that you need, if you want to, I think most people agree, the question why is there something rather than nothing makes sense. There's some sense that nothing doesn't need explaining because there's no thing there. Whereas if you just say did nothing come from something, there's something kind of, where did that come from? If there's actually a thing there. So I feel like a naturalistic picture of reality kind of needs to begin with nothing. And the thought I came to is that nothingness is synonymous. Within nothingness, we're talking here about nothingness being the ground of reality, which we'll get onto your perspective on that in a second. But within nothingness, there can't be bounds or limits. So it's kind of synonymous with some kind of infinite unboundedness. I mentioned this earlier, this kind of sympathy I have for the idea of openness, unboundedness. And within that, within space of infinity, anything that can happen will happen. So it's kind of synonymous with potentiality or some kind of generative nature. And so I feel like everything that takes place, it feels to me arises within that paradoxical kind of the generative nature of nothingness, which is it's totally unconstrained, so it's generative, but then it's also totally there's nothing there, so there's nothing for those forms to grab onto, so they're impermanent and they're kind of returning to that ground of nothingness. So this, I found resonances with kind of Buddhist philosophy of this. It's kind of like I guess you could say Ouroboros, kind of snake eating its own tail vision of kind of nothingness outpouring beyond itself, but always returning to itself. And again, that for me, the way I treat that is as a speculative metaphysical story that I hold very lightly, because I'm not trying to kind of defend that on as, again, given my predilection to thinking of ideas in a very humble way in terms of their limit to trying and encase reality. But so that's just to give you a sense of why I sympathize with the view that nothingness grounds reality. And it's interesting to me that I came to it from this kind of way of thinking, which was also informed by phenomenology and meditation, stuff like that. But you came to it through this logical route. And so you say that, there are these three properties that are important of nothingness. It's contradictory. But the other two are also very relevant for what I just said. One, that it is the ground of reality, ground of being. And the other is that it's ineffable. And so it's ineffable. Yeah, I just went on to F all about it and just kind of say that it has certain properties. It's actually, I can say these positive things, whether it's infinite or even then that's a negative, I guess, like a negation that's not finite, or but potentiality feels like a quality that I'm imbuing it with. So yeah, I wonder what your thoughts are on the fact that it's, where I've seen you speak about this before, you said that it's ineffable, yet we go on to talk about it, and that's not specific to this issue of nothingness that happens, routinely in philosophy.
Yeah. So there's the ground of reality business, and there's the ineffability business, and they're different. Okay, but right. Let's talk about the ineffability business first. There are reasons to think that you can't say anything about nothingness. Why? Because there's nothing there to say anything about. if you predicate something of something, there must be something there to predicate it on. Okay, so there's at least some reason to suppose that nothingness is ineffable. But of course, you've just talked about it, so have I, so you can talk about it. Is that a contradiction? Yes, yes it is. Do I think it's a true contradiction? Yes, I do. And many philosophers in the history of philosophy, East and West, have found themselves in this situation, not so much over nothingness, but about lots of other things. So Christians and Muslims tend to say that God is ineffable, but of course they say a lot about God. Kant thought that what he called noumena were ineffable, but he said things about them. Heidegger thinks that being is ineffable and writes, 100 volumes of work about it. Wittgenstein thought that the form of a fact or proposition is ineffable, and then writes the Tractatus about it. Nagarjuna says that ultimate reality is ineffable, but writes a lot about it. The Tao Te Ching says that the Tao is ineffable, and then writes a book about it. So I'm not saying all these views are right. I don't think they are, but there's a phenomenon you get in the history of philosophy, East and West, when you talk about the limits of language, and you suppose that language does have its limits. It's very hard to argue for that without talking about things that are ineffable. And if you are in that situation, you're in this situation where you're talking about, if your theory is correct, you're stuck with that. So I think in the case of nothingness, it's exactly one of these situations. And that's a situation where I would be inclined to endorse it. The others we can argue about another time.
Right. And then when it comes to your opinion of it being the ground of reality, perhaps you could explain to the audience your, I guess, about ontological dependence and why it is that you think we need to invoke nothingness.
Let me give you an analogy. Suppose you're in the middle of a field and in the middle is a hill or a mountain or something. What makes it a mountain? It's the fact that its height is different from the height of the surrounding field. If its height were the same as the field, it wouldn't be a mountain. It would just be part of the field, right? So to be a hill is to stand out from the ground around it. Okay. Now you can make a similar kind of argument for an object. What is it to be an object? Well, an object is something that is not nothing, so it must be distinguishable from nothingness. Okay, it's got to, as it were, stand out above the ground of nothingness, in just the way that the hills stand out above the ground of the field around it. This is not my thought; it's actually Heidegger's, which I think is right about. That to be an object precisely is to sort of stand out from nothingness. I mean, if it didn't, there wouldn't be anything there, so there wouldn't be an object there. Okay. So nothingness is the ground of any object. Okay, not quite the physical ground like a hill, but the kind of metaphysical ground, if you like. So, as you said, you can't have an object without there being nothingness, because if there weren't some kind of nothingness to stand out from, it couldn't be an object. Right? That's roughly why I think that reality depends on nothingness, because reality is composed of objects, and objects depend on standing out from nothingness to be an object. Okay. Now, when you were talking about your view, you also built in something else to this, namely the generative effect of nothingness. So, a very natural thought, if you're in this mood, is to say that in some sense, nothingness generates every object. I personally would not want to go that far, but there are certainly plenty of philosophers who do say this. So in the Tao Te Ching, Tao, which is they say is nothing, um, actually generates the phenomenological world. If you're a certain kind of Christian, like Meister Eckhart, you think that God creates the world and God is nothingness, so nothingness creates the world. Um, and if you think that the quantum void is nothingness, which is not at all obvious, but if you think that, if you think the quantum void creates reality, then there's another example of nothingness creating the world. Okay, so we might argue about all these views. I'm not saying they're right, but there's certainly plenty of people around who think that nothingness has this generative potential of impact or nature. Not quite sure what you call it.
Right. Yeah, because
Um,
I think, is it Parmenides who had this famous phrase that nothing comes from nothing? It was basically saying like, nothingness doesn't, yeah, you can't do what I'm doing, I guess, here. But then you have philosophers like Nishida who talk about nothingness in terms of an absolute nothingness, I think of the kind that I'm talking about, that's not like a conventional nothingness in terms of like just simple absence, but it's the, yeah, this profound generative kind of Taoist. You know, you point to in the Tao Te Ching, yeah, it says things like the Tao is like a bellows. It's the fact that it's empty that allows it to create this wind of kind of, yeah,
no,
reality.
that's right. I mean, Nishida is probably a philosopher who's not particularly well known to most Westerners, but he's probably the most significant Japanese philosopher of the 20th century. And he's the sort of founding father of something called the Kyoto School. So called because he taught at Kyoto, so he influenced a lot of people in Kyoto. Um, and he's drawing on his Zen heritage as well as his Western heritage, or what he knows about Western philosophy. Um, and in Zen draws very strongly on Taoism.
Right.
Uh, and so the kind of ultimate reality in Zen is kind of often elided with Tao. Um, and so it's taken to have this sort of generative function that in some sense it's the ground of a phenomenological world. And that's more or less his view. And he's drawing on not only his Taoist heritage, but actually he's drawing on Hegel and Heidegger as well. Heidegger held a very similar view that sort of being generates beings. Being, the thing, generates the things which be, i.e., beings, things which are. Okay, doesn't sound quite so good in English. Um, and then Heidegger says, well, yeah, and being is nothingness, you know. And why he thinks that, so that's another question, but that's what his view. So Nishida takes this very heady mix of Zen and Heidegger, puts them together, and comes up with a very intriguing view.
Yeah. And I think with the another, you know, I was talking about how you can come at this insight or this opinion, this belief about nothingness from different angles within the kind of meditative traditions. There's also a kind of phenomenological way into it of deconstructing experience to kind of see an insubstantiality, that the naive realism you had of solid objects, to experience that as a construct, and to feel that actually behind that there is, yes, maybe a kind of insubstantiality and absence and emptiness. I think then one can really, that's another route into this, to it feeling kind of plausible that everything is taking place within nothingness, or if that's the ground. But I think I heard you say, you know, you know a lot about Buddhist philosophy, but you're not a meditator yourself, right?
Correct.
Right. Have you never been intrigued by the phenomenological approach to this stuff?
Oh, sure. I just find meditating too hard.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah.
I mean, it requires a lot more discipline than I have.
Yeah. This is wonderful. Thanks so much, Graham. I've really enjoyed speaking to you today. And do you have any online presence you would point people to if they want to look into your books or anything else?
No, I mean, if they're interested in what I've written, I've got a website, grahampriest.net. They can find out uh, the things I've written there.
That's great. All right. And thanks again.
You're welcome.
Thanks thanks for listening. If you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe. And if you want to help the podcast reach a wider audience, you can leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Finally, if you want to offer financial support, you can go to patreon.com/Dr. James Cook.